Suddenly, one day, as Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from eines Morgens aus unruhigen Träumen had changed. Good evening, and no matter when you happen to be listening to this, it is always evening here at Tom's Terror Trove. Tonight, we begin a series of character examinations, casting a beady eye over the books that provide the literary jumping-off points for the subsequent lives and unlives of the sinners in Limbus Company. Appropriately enough, we're beginning with Gregor. We'll have a wee chat about suffering, transformation, patriarchs and matriarchs, the remnants of European city-states in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, more relevant than you might think to this South Korean gacha game. Well, not really, but they will be brought up, so keep your eyes, and other things, like apples, peeled. We'll also look at translation and the problems and opportunities it presents. There will also be, as per tradition, a fun... Oh wait, hang on, forgot to get out my air quotes this time. Just a second. Oh, there they are. Fun, swish, 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 dubbing section, in which I demonstrate how Gregor of the LBC might sound if he spoke German like his literary counterpart. All ready, listener bud? Here we go. Franz Kafka, the author of Die Verwandlung, the Metamorphosis, the Transformation, died in 1924 at 40 years of age, throat closed from tuberculosis, starving, in a sanatorium just outside Vienna. The Metamorphosis, released in 1915, from which our world-weary warrior and punch-clock pariah Gregor emerges, was just one of a few works that were published in his lifetime, yet his legacy looms over world literature to this day. Now, there are an infinite number of excellent explanations of what Kafkaesque means, so despite the fact that this is technically a YouTube video essay, for the few hardy souls listening to this on Spotify, I salute you. I won't be going into that here. Suffice to say that the labyrinthine and often oppressive and opaque systems that govern and animate the life of Project Moon's vast city more often than not bubble over into the realm of the Kafkaesque. And after all, something that people sometimes forget about a lot of Kafka's work is that it is often bleakly humorous. So, to work. Remembering, of course, that everything I say here is supplementary. Treat it as a jumping-off point. Perhaps a prod, a spur for your own reading and listening and theorizing, or an accompaniment to other really fantastic videos about Gregor out there. I personally found Pickle Bloom's video really interesting and instructive. Now, in the process of creating this video, I undertook to read through the Metamorphosis again, first picking out some salient details that seem to resonate with Gregor of the game, and contrasting those with the points that either contradicted or didn't seem to line up so neatly. As always, more questions asked than answered, and I also drew on an article about suffering, death, and rebirth. As always, sources are in the episode description. So, similarities. Where is Gregor the same as the book? Now, the districts, wings, and nests of the city are not dissimilar to the city-states of antiquity, and indeed a way of dividing up the world that would not be unfamiliar to Kafka, living as he did within a German-speaking Jewish community in Prague during the days of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Let's trape through about 10 similar moments and character traits, some facile, some with rather more profound meanings. 1. Smoking. Now, Gregor in the book does not smoke. However, he does have trouble with his lungs. Now, it's impossible not to see echoes of Kafka, afflicted as he was with TB, a disease that affects the lungs, in the character of Gregor. Indeed, the autobiographical element in Kafka's novels and short stories is undeniable, even essential to unlocking their deeper meanings. His relationship with his father, in particular, is... well, but more on that later. 2. Old G-Corp. There's a scene in Canto 1 where Gregor's former head manager, interesting choice of words given his buggy pate, admonishes Gregor in game for shirking his duties, mightily similar to the visit from the chief clerk in the book. 3. The door that appears to Tante when grasping Faust's hand. Now, this is more obviously related to hell, resurrection, stuff like that, and of course, gateways and portals abound in the symbolic and allegorical language of humanity. But if you'll permit me a bit of a tangent, I'm reminded of a different Kafka story, actually, Before the Law. This door was made for you alone. You can actually check out my reading of said story at the end of my Metamorphosis work-in-progress livestream. 4. Temperament. If you'll remember from fairly early in Limbus Company's story, Gregor flashed what looked like his best attempt at a kind smile at our new passenger, hoping to strike up a conversation, and the corners of his eyes twitched from forcing a facial expression he obviously wasn't used to, but I pretended not to notice. Now those are both quotes from Canto 1. Between this and some lighter moments in Cantos 2 and 3 when Gregor tries to act out a bit, we gain some insight into his character. He is reactive, easygoing. In the book, I would say he's a lot more passive and prissier, and this can be shown by the contrast in the book with, "Well," said Gregor, knowing perfectly that he was the only one who had retained any composure. "I'll put my clothes on at once, pack up my samples, and start off. Will you only let me go? You see, sir, I'm not obstinate, and I'm willing to work. Travelling is a hard life, but I couldn't live without it. Where are you going, sir? To the office, yes? Will you give a true account of all this? One can be temporarily incapacitated, but that's just the moment for remembering former services and bearing in mind that later on, when the incapacity has been got over, one will certainly work with all the more industry and concentration. I'm loyally bound to serve the chief. You know that very well." Gregor here is falling over himself to ingratiate himself with the chief clerk. I think that Gregor of the game has maybe been through that, having been a soldier. We're encountering him at a later point in his life. I'll talk about this a little more deeply later on when we really delve into the ideas of rebirth. And perhaps, possibly like many of the sinners, this Gregor, our Gregor, is one who has lived many lives. 5. The Smoke War. More contextual than anything else, but the Metamorphosis was published as the Great War of 1914 was rumbling to life and mass death. It is a tenuous connection, but I can't help but think that the old G-Corp, with its emphasis on innovative weapons, obviously biomechanical in this case, albeit in limited supply, puts me in mind of the similar problems faced by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, of which Kafka's Prague was then a part. Modern and effective weapons, their artillery was second to none, but in short supply, contributing to their downfall. Couple this with the imagery of former G-Corp veterans, with their unsightly and to non-combatants frightening heads and limbs. It's highly reminiscent of the stigma that injured soldiers, particularly after the First World War, experienced upon their return home. The truly industrial nature of war in the 20th century and the scale of mutilation was beginning to unfold. 6. Gregor in the book is a woodworker of some note. Fretwork, I think it's deliberately called, although there's an incidental double meaning there. Of course, to fret means to worry, and Gregor worries a lot. Anyway, he's carved a beautiful picture frame at some point prior to the events of the novella. Can anyone in the comments help me out here? Do we know whether Game Gregor has exhibited similar interests? 7. It's a debatable case, but it is curious that, despite being Hermann's son, and therefore one would assume a shoo-in for high status in the Corp, Gregor was still basically a frontline soldier. Now this is somewhat reflective of the hapless travelling salesman nature of book Gregor. I suspect it's also very much in keeping with the character of Hermann, however. Children are a resource, but also a reflection of your status, your own genius. Authoritarian and demanding, a description that also fits book Gregor's and Kafka's own father. 8. Bug arm equals right arm. Gregor in the book sleeps on his right side. Utterly trivial, and actually even more trivial to note, In Latin, the language of ancient Rome, the right hand was called dexter and the left sinister, with leftness having an evil connotation, hence why we still use the word sinister to mean evil, unpleasant. It actually got to such a point that those Romans of a superstitious nature would never pass through a threshold left side first. It's a good thing our favourite bug boy is a dexter rather than a sinister. Please don't misconstrue this for anti-lefty prejudice on my part, though. 9. Hermann. This is a big one. As many of you may know, while Gregor's father in the book goes unnamed, Kafka's father was named Hermann, described by his son as a true Kafka in strength, health, appetite, loudness of voice, eloquence, self-satisfaction, worldly dominance, endurance, presence of mind, knowledge of human nature, a certain way of doing things on a grand scale. Of course, also with all the defects and weaknesses that go with these advantages, and into which your temperament and sometimes your hot temper drive you. That's from a letter that Kafka wrote to his father. The parallels with Gregor's mother are very clear and deliberate. Seemingly all-powerful, maintaining a control perhaps yet to be fully realized, although we did learn a lot with the latest canto, I'm given to understand. I didn't read too much ahead, I swear, over their offspring that will never truly be shaken off. 10. The apple. This has a great many implications. From the biblical allusion, the fact that an apple wounds Gregor in the book, the fact that the apple and the repetitive notion and nature of slicing it is what eventually kind of liberates Gregor in the game. And again, the almost meditative state that he gets into as he chops the apple. Gregor in the game is acting upon something, whereas Gregor in the book is acted upon. This is another little echo of the fact that the Gregor we meet in Limbus Company is perhaps one who has purged some of the passivity and experienced more and is a more complete and fulfilled Gregor than the one in the book. And this leads me into the next topic: suffering, death, and rebirth. The work of Franz Kafka, in many respects, expresses a deeply pessimistic worldview. Philosophically, I mean. Philosophical pessimism posits, among other things, that life, existence itself, is of negative value. Tormented by illness, self-reproach, and an overbearing, to say the least, father, it's no wonder that a bleak view of this goodly frame the earth bled into his works. It's worth thinking about Kafka himself in relation to Gregor and the Gregor of Limbus Company. The effect of pessimism, particularly the pessimism of philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, and his view that life is what Eastern religious philosophy calls samsara. Samsa, samsara. This life of birth, suffering, sickness, lust, craving, old age, death, and rebirth. A biographer of Kafka considered the phrase ungeheures Ungeziefer and reminded us that Kafka, reader of etymologies, knew what depth of unbeing underlies this phrase. I think I pointed out again in the live stream that Ungeziefer comes from the I think it's Middle German and means more so than just like vermin or a monster. It means an unclean thing, unfit for sacrifice. There's a lot to unpack, as people say, there. And Kafka was extremely widely read philosophically in Eastern religions and also theosophy and the works of Rudolf Steiner. But that's a whole other thing. I have a bit of a connection with Steiner, at least in terms of my schooling, but that's probably a little bit too much information. Anyway, but very interesting, again, in reading for this episode, seeing the connection. He in fact met Steiner, but I've said too much. This work that I read regarding the metamorphosis and transformation also went on to say that in Kafka's works, he transcends his existence as merely the author. It is a transmigration of his soul into new lives and bodies, hence why so often the protagonists of Kafka's novellas and short stories are very much identified with the author, but this is a strength rather than a weakness. He thus watches himself in this new life, his father once again stalking him within, causing suffering and a consequent death, whether by suicide or slow starvation. And this will tie into two other works that I'm going to briefly touch on that make for very good accompaniment of the Metamorphosis. And they're short, which is pretty sweet. As he dies within each story, Kafka views himself reborn in another. For you see, the Metamorphosis is actually, in a sense, part of a trilogy of stories. So, Das Urteil, in which a man confronts and is confronted by his monstrous father, and In der Strafkolonie, describing the last use of an elaborate torture and execution device that carves the name of the offence that the condemned prisoner committed on his skin as he slowly dies over the course of 12 hours, and is also subject to some kind of revelation. As the plot unfolds, the reader learns more and more about the machine, including its origin and original justification. Very deep and philosophical, but also, holy crap, that is frickin' metal. And this relation is very clear. In 1915, Kafka wrote, "If the two elements most pronounced in the Stoker and in Der Strafkolonie do not combine, I am finished." Kafka apparently considered the creation and continuation of such connections somewhat important. This is why he wants Das Urteil, die Verwandlung, the Metamorphosis, and In der Strafkolonie to appear under the common name of Strafen. Kafka is clear that the Metamorphosis must accompany Das Urteil and In der Strafkolonie if they are together. In fact, the rebirth, here we go, of Georg Bendeman from Das Urteil, he dies at the end of the story, sorry, spoilers, the suffering of Gregor Samsa and his transmigration as Reisender suggests that Gregor could not break the cycle of transmigration, at least, maybe not until Limbus Company. Therefore, Kafka tortures his hero with yet another life in this samsaric world. An Eastern influence such as the idea of samsara calls perhaps for a definition of what we mean by the term Kafkaesque. In fact, a passage in the Metamorphosis really stuck out to me as I was reading. I feel a little bit vindicated. You see the notes on the screen here. The line is, "With toothless jaws of even the finest make, one could do nothing." Now, what does this really mean? Gregor continues to be hungry even as he starves, but it's probably because he's not hungry for earthly food. He's moved beyond the need for that kind of sustenance, or even his ability to process that kind of sustenance. Max Brod, Kafka's friend and literary executor, wrote, "Thus, for Kafka, art serves the religious principle of giving meaning to life." Interesting to think about the artistic connection with Hermann in the game. Kafka offers meaning as a goal which is found through a process, the search for inspiration. Gregor searches for inspiration, book Gregor, and finds it through the music of his sister, Greta. I really hope we actually find out more about game Gregor's sister. This is perhaps Schopenhauerian with a Kafkaesque twist. Inspired to die, Gregor is so moved that he felt as if he were being shown the path to the unknown food he was yearning for. And the rebirth of Georg Bendeman, the suffering of Gregor Samsa, and his transmigration, again, the rebirth, the suffering, does suggest that Gregor of the book could not break the cycle. Will Gregor from the game? Time will tell. Now, Gregor in the book does not speak, or at least he does, but he is not understood by anyone. So most of his dialogue is interior. So how does that interior compare with Limbus's exterior? Now, it's here that we run into the problem of translation, meaning, and communication. It's not a silly question to ask that if I read Der Verwandlung, the Metamorphosis, in translation, am I really reading it? Am I reading that same book? It evokes the questions I've sometimes had when playing through Limbus Company. I don't speak Korean. I am reading a translation. And additionally, in the reality of the game, since the other sinners usually rely on Faust to translate for our manager stand-in Dante, what do they really understand about the clock-headed one? The afterword of a 2014 translation of The Metamorphosis by Susan Bernofsky puts it very well. The story's protagonist, Gregor Samsa, is the quintessential Kafka anti-hero. He has worked himself to the point of utter exhaustion to pay off his parents' debts, and his grotesque metamorphosis is the physical manifestation of his abasement. What exactly is he transformed into, though? In Kafka's correspondence with his publisher, he was adamant that the insect not be depicted on the jacket of the book, and although he and his friends used the word bug, Wanze, when referring casually to the story, the language that appears in the novella itself is carefully chosen to avoid specificity. The epithet ungeheures Ungeziefer in the opening sentence poses one of the greatest challenges to the translator. Both the adjective ungeheuer, meaning monstrous or huge, and the noun Ungeziefer are negations, virtual non-entities, prefixed by un. Ungeziefer comes from the Middle High German Ungeziebere, a negation of the Old High German Zebar, relating to the Old English Tiber, meaning sacrifice or sacrificial animal. So, an Ungeziebere, then, is an unclean animal, unfit for sacrifice, as I mentioned earlier. And Ungeziefer describes the class of nasty, creepy, crawly things. Interesting to note, the word in German suggests primarily six-legged critters, though it otherwise resembles the English word vermin, which refers primarily to rodents. Ungeziefer is also used informally as the equivalent of bug, though the connotation is dirty, nasty bug. You wouldn't apply the word to cute, helpful creatures like ladybugs. In this particular translation, Gregor is transformed into some sort of monstrous insect, with some sort of added to blur the borders of the somewhat too specific insect. I think Kafka wanted us to see Gregor's new body and condition with the same hazy focus with which Gregor himself discovers them. And the post-metamorphosis activity that gives Gregor the greatest sense of freedom appears in that translation as crawling. He enjoys crawling around the walls and ceiling of his room. Ironically, the German verb kriechen, which also translates as to creep, has the additional meaning of to cower, to kriechen before someone is to act sycophantically toward him. In this sense, too, Gregor's new physical state appears as a representation of his long-standing spiritual abjectness, which ties us into what I was speaking about earlier. Redemption is at hand, though. One last translation problem in the story is the title itself. Unlike the English metamorphosis, the German word Verwandlung does not suggest a natural change of state associated with the animal kingdom, such as the change from caterpillar to butterfly. Instead, it is a word from fairy tales used to describe the transformation, say, of a girl's 7 brothers into swans. But the word metamorphosis refers to this too. Its first definition in the Oxford English Dictionary is the action or process of changing in form, shape, or substance, especially transformation by supernatural means. Now, this is the sense in which it's used, for instance, in translations of Ovid. As a title for this rich, complex story, it strikes that particular translator as the most luminous, suggestive choice. As an exercise, trying to make use of my Collins German Dictionary and Grammar, and I won't deny Google Translate, I had a go at producing a Deutsch dub of a particularly affecting scene. Ich glaube, ich hatte einmal einen beunruhigenden Albtraum. Vielleicht stecke ich ja immer noch in einer fest, sogar jetzt noch. In diesem Traum gibt es in dem Raum, in dem ich stehe, nur 2 Farben, das Blau, das jede Wand bedeckt, und der herabhängende rote Punkt. Ich weiß auch, wie ich hier wieder rauskomme. Ich musste nur meinen Arm ausstrecken und den hängenden Apfel abschneiden. I also tried out a voice that fits more with my mental picture of the book Gregor, a little more subservient, a little pressier, overlaying it onto game Gregor. Cornered, Gregor suddenly started shouting in a remarkably robotic cadence. We can't live like this anymore. This is outrageous abuse. To tie people up and force them to dig. Let us all rise up and fight our oppressors. Forward! Charge! Yeah. Game Gregor is another transformation. A vision. One shadow among many of perhaps a more fulfilled and worldly Gregor than that of the book. Some dreams have been realized, and the veil of pessimism lifted. Book Gregor is a salesman, but what he sold is himself, his own agency and dignity, making him a sellout through and through. The Metamorphosis is Kafka's own Death of a Salesman, if you know that play, with all the sad, grubby tragedy, the squalor. Like Willy Loman in the play, Gregor is a suicide, though of a different sort. He dies a hunger artist, perishing of starvation because nothing tastes good to him anymore, at least not on this earth. And like Willy, Gregor's death is the final service he performs for the benefit of his family. Game Gregor is a soldier, but one that is slowly reconciling with his past, slowly breaking free of the shackles of death, suffering, and desire, and perhaps realizing his true potential, destructive though that might possibly be. However, the hand of the past may yet reach out to grab him once again and alter his future. Through der Strafkolonie, das Urteil, die Verwandlung, the smoke war, Gregor is reborn once again to take his place in the pantheon of sinners aboard Mephistopheles, restlessly searching for the golden boughs. Given the events of Canto 9, I will simply say that Gregor deserves some peace, in this life at least. It's also important to remember that beyond the theorizing, the breadcrumb trails, the layers, the subtext, the allusions, these are stories that make us feel something. They have intrinsic value as narratives, as entertainment, as a chance to peer into a world other than our own. We read the Metamorphosis because it makes us feel sad, happy, frightened, confused, very confused sometimes, curious. We play Limbus Company because, after all, it's fun, right? And part of that fun is talking about it, like we're doing here, and like I know I will inevitably see in all the fantastic comments that you will make. It's fun, right? Vroom vroom. Thank you very much for listening and watching. The Project Moon train continues to barrel along the tracks. What a turn 2026 has taken already. If you've enjoyed this episode, I hope you'll consider subscribing and sticking around for the time being. I'm aiming to alternate Limbus Company character analyses every 3 weeks or so, as I get the scripts done with a work-in-progress live stream, and who knows what else. Might take a bit longer for some of the more daunting books. Before I sign off, I'll mention I do all this myself, as you can probably kind of tell from the slightly crummy presentation. However, the wonderful voice actors who contribute their talents to the crawling world notwithstanding, and therefore, liking, subscribing, commenting and rating wherever you happen to be listening or watching helps out the podcast, channel, whatever this is, immensely. My thanks to those who do show their support, however that may manifest, whether it's a donation, a comment, a review, etc. Thank you so much. Stay tuned for more Limbus Company related lore episodes, tales of classic horror, and all sorts of other good things. With that, I will bid you good night and farewell for now. Take care. It's a scary world out there.